This article is from the Smithsonian Magazine. The title is "The Kansas Homestead Where America's First Serial Killer Family Committed Its Crimes is Up for Sale." Authorities recovered the bodies of up to 11 people from the Old West tract of land owned by the notorious Bloody Benders. This article is from Smithsonian Magazine in February of 2020. Now you can see a picture. There's the elder John and Kate Bender, and then the younger son, John Jr., and the younger daughter, Kate Bender. She also goes by the name Elvira, and sometimes I've seen her called Mary. It says, the Bender family abandoned the scene of their crimes, and their ultimate fate remains unclear. In the 1870s, a family of four settled on the frontier prairie lands of southeastern Kansas, not far from the town of Cherryvale. John and Kate Bender, along with their two adult children, also named John and Kate, operated an inn and grocery store that catered to travelers along a nearby road until one day they vanished. Locals initially thought the Benders were the latest victims in a string of mysterious disappearances plaguing the area, but it soon became clear that the family had played a more malevolent role in the story. An investigation of the Bender property revealed the remains of an estimated 11 individuals buried in the garden, their skulls smashed in and throats slashed. The family members who appeared to have fled the scene were quickly identified as the perpetrators of these grisly murders. Today, the Bloody Benders endure as a notorious serial killing family of the Old West, and as Jonathan Riley reports for the Salina Journal, the land where they committed their crimes is now up for sale. So, as of 2020, February 2020, the land which these crimes happened on, was up for sale by the family who lived there. The historic Bender family farm, or the historic Bender farm, is listed as Tract 2 in a bundle of 15 properties heading to auction on February 11th. Schrader, the Indiana-based real estate and auction company facilitating the sale, describes the 162-acre tract as containing some mature trees and a beautiful view overlooking Drum Creek and the farmland bottoms below. According to Amy Renee Leaker of the Wichita Eagle, the property's current owners purchased the land in the 1950s or 60s, long after souvenir seekers drawn in by the gory tale had picked apart the original Bender homestead. It's strictly cropland, Brent Wellings, Schrader's Southwest auction manager, tells the Eagle. He suspects that the property will continue to be used as farmland by its new owner, but notes that the upcoming sale of the property could provide a neat opportunity for somebody who's interested in that type of history. The Benders are often described as a family of German descent, though little is known about them, and some researchers have questioned whether they were actually related. They arrived in Kansas after the southeastern part of the state had opened to settlers, according to the Kansas Historical Society. A historical marker set up near the Bender farm states that the younger Kate soon gained notoriety as a self-proclaimed healer and spiritualist. A canvas curtain divided the family's home into two sections. The front half was used as an inn and general store selling goods like crackers, sardines, and candies, but the sleeping quarters in the back of the property were employed for far more sinister purposes. The family is said to have enticed travelers into the small cabin with the promise of a hot meal and a chance to rest. According to the Salina Journal, the authorities were able to piece together the Benders' modus operandi based on evidence found at the scene. One of the family members would hide behind the dividing curtain, then creep up on the victim from behind and attack them with a hammer. The hapless individual was then dropped through a trap door into the cellar, where another waiting Bender would slash their throat. After removing anything of value from the dead, the Benders waited until nightfall and buried the bodies on the property. Because it was not uncommon for travelers to go missing on the rough frontiers of the Old West, it took some time before victims' disappearances began to attract notice. Alarm bells were first raised when one George Lochner and his daughter, traveling from Kansas to visit family in Iowa, vanished without a trace. Then a well-known local doctor named William York disappeared. His brothers traced York's last known whereabouts to the Bender farm. The family admitted he had been there but said the doctor had not stayed for long. In spring 1873, a local noticed that the Bender Inn had been abandoned and upon closer investigation found the family's livestock dead or starving. Subsequent searches of the property revealed a blood-soaked cellar and multiple bodies in the garden. One of Dr. York's brother was able to identify his remains. Lochner and his daughter were found buried together in a single grave. Though authorities issued a $2,000 reward for the family's capture, their fate remains unclear. Some say the Benders were killed by vigilantes, others believe they successfully escaped punishment. Today, the tract of land holds no visible signs of the farm's macabre history. The Bender's cabin was demolished long ago, and the precise location of the home and its garden are not known. But morbid mementos of the crime may still linger beneath the surface of the land. Though most accounts place the number of victims at around a dozen, some believe the Benders killed as many as 21 people. And Wellens tells the Eagle he is pretty confident the property has never been scanned for missing bodies. This was from 2020 from the Smithsonian Magazine. And to my understanding, the property was sold for I think $1 or $2 million. So their tract of land and then other tracts put together were auctioned off. I don't know who the new owners are currently. This article is from the Kansaspedia, Kansas Historical Society. And this is on Kate Bender, the younger daughter. It says, leading member of the Bloody Benders, Kate Bender gained the reputation as an attractive but dangerous woman in her Labette County community. She lived with her parents and brother while helping them run an isolated grocery and roadhouse. Somewhat an alien in the midst of the other family members, she was the only one to culture social skills. She also had an alleged gift for second sight and spiritualism and distributed advertising circulars throughout the county proclaiming her abilities. Her enduring fame, however, would come from other skills, namely that of murderer, for Kate was the leading member of the Bloody Benders. The small Bender home was divided into 2 rooms by a canvas cloth. There was a table, stove, and grocery stores in front and beds in the back, along with a pit-like cellar covered by a trap door. The Bender family's crimes were considered some of the more gruesome perpetrated on Kansas soil. John, his wife, son, and daughter Kate operated an inn outside of Parsons from 1871 to 1873. The inn was located on a main road, and travelers would often stop for food and rest. Many never left. While seated on the bench near the temporary wall, their heads made perfect outline in the canvas. It was a simple matter to murder the victim with a sledgehammer kept on hand for just that purpose. The bodies were then tossed into the cellar until they could be removed. When suspicions were aroused in 1873, the Benders fled. 11 bodies were found with crushed skulls in the Bender garden. No one has ever been able to prove what happened to Kate and her family, even though a nationwide manhunt turned up suspects for many years after. There's a drawing or sketch of Kate Bender. See if I can enlarge this picture. It says, Professor Miss Katie Bender can heal all, I believe it says sorts of diseases, can cure blindness, fits, deafness, and all such diseases, also deaf and dumbness. Residents 14 miles east of Independence on the road from Independence to Osage Mission, 1.5 miles southeast of Nora Head Station. Katie Bender, June 18th, 1872. So this is a flyer that she put out to advertise her services. And this is a knife found in their cabin, I believe. Let me go here and read the article about the Bender knife. This knife is a gruesome memento of a series of murders in southeastern Kansas. It was as if the men had been snatched off the earth. A terror slowly descended on the countryside. It seemed that death stalked the highway, and men began to fear darkness and night. That was written by J.E. McDowell, Bender historian. Two men settled a claim near the town of Cherryville in southeastern Kansas in 1870. John Bender Sr. and John Bender Jr. built a one-room timber cabin with a trap door that led to a stone cellar. Once the lodging was complete, the Bender men sent for the rest of the family, a mother and a daughter, both named Kate. Remember, the mother also went by Elvira or Mary in some stories about this family, so I'm not sure which name is correct. The family outfitted the house with furniture and supplies and hung a canvas curtain to divide it into two rooms. The Benders turned the front half into an inn and grocery store where travelers on the nearby Osage Trail could find rest, supplies, and a warm meal. Ma and Kate planted a garden and small orchard near the house. By all appearances, the Benders were, like most area settlers, a family of German descent who came west for a fresh start. Business at the Bender Inn would have been brisk. The southeast corner of Kansas had recently opened to white settlers, and men regularly arrived with money to purchase land and livestock. This available cash made the area a dangerous place to travel. Settlers were easy prey for robbers, and it was not uncommon for people to go missing. No one took note of people looking for their family members. This changed when locals started disappearing. Vanishing travelers. The first disappearance to receive notice was that of George Lochner and his daughter of Independence. After the death of his wife, Lochner was taken, they have it spelled Launcher, but I've also seen it spelled Lochner, was taking his daughter to Iowa to stay with family. They never made it, but their wagon was found near Fort Scott. There were no clues as to the Lochners' whereabouts. Soon after, another Independence resident vanished. William York was a well-known local doctor who had been visiting family in Fort Scott in early March 1873. He headed home on horseback but was never seen alive again. When he did not return, his wife contacted Alexander and Edward York, her husband's brothers. They traced him to the Bender Inn. The family reluctantly admitted that Dr. York had stopped there but soon went on his way. It was a dead end. The Benders were the last to see the doctor. The news of Dr. York's disappearance caused fear and worry among the residents of Cherryville. While missing persons were not uncommon, an inordinate number had vanished near their town. Between 1871 and early 1873, at least 11 people had their last known whereabouts traced to the small community. After the disappearance of Dr. York, locals decided to search every farm in the area for evidence. In early May, a young man noticed that the Bender Inn appeared abandoned. With closer examination, he found dead and emaciated livestock in the barn, suggesting the owners had been gone for some time. All that remained of the Benders were 3 hammers, a knife, a German Bible, and a clock with a compartment containing jewelry. At first, the townspeople thought the Benders were the latest victims, but a search of their farm revealed something far more sinister. The Benders were serial killers. The trapdoor in the cabin led to a cellar whose floor was covered with dried pools of blood, the smell gagging the searchers. Depressions in the soil of the well-cultivated orchard contained the graves of the Benders' victims. Dr. York was the first uncovered. His brother Edward joined the search team and identified the body. The back of the skull was smashed and the throat sliced. Lochner and his daughter were found together in a grave. In total, the team found between 8 and 11 bodies, some of them unrecognizable. Those stories of strange experiences at the inn had circulated throughout the community since its establishment. Few had given them credence. After the discovery, though, such tales seemed more plausible. Neighbors reported violent behavior, strange seances, and narrowly escaping with their lives. Those who escaped described being forced to sit at a table with their backs against a stained canvas curtain. I guess the stains were blood. Everyone assumed that Kate distracted the visitor while one of the men hit him on the back of the head with a hammer. The murderers then dropped the body through the trap door into the cellar and sliced the throat to ensure death. The Benders removed anything of value before burying the body in the orchard. The community formed 2 posses to hunt down the murderers. A ticket agent in Thayer, Kansas, reported selling tickets to 4 people matching their descriptions. From Thayer, the 12 of the Benders disappeared. Kansas's governor even issued a $2,000 reward for the family's apprehension, but to no avail. Though stories abound, to this day no one knows for certain what became of the bloody Benders. Elizabeth York, wife of Edward York, donated the knife shown here to the Kansas Museum of History. According to Mrs. York, her husband removed it from the Bender Inn the day his brother's body was found. It may have belonged to the Benders or one of their victims. Today, the knife is in the museum collections. And here's a close-up of the knife blade. So it looks like it has blood on it. I don't know if that was related to the murders or not. Let me pull this up. This is the Governor's Proclamation $2,000 reward, State of Kansas Executive Department. So this is the reward offer flyer. It says, whereas several atrocious murders have been recently committed in Labette County, Kansas, under circumstances which fasten beyond doubt the commissions of these crimes upon a family known as the Bender family, consisting of John Bender, about 60 years of age, 5 feet 8 or 9 inches in height, German, speaks but little English, dark complexion, no whiskers, and sparsely built. Mrs. Bender, about 50 years old of age. I've also seen some reports where they said she was 55. Rather heavy set, blue eyes, brown hair, German, speaks broken English. John Bender Jr., alias John Gebhardt, 5 feet 8 or 9 inches in height, slightly built, gray eyes with brownish tint, brown hair, light mustache, no whiskers, about 27 years of age, speaks English with German accent. Kate Bender, about 24 years of age, dark hair and eyes, good looking, well formed, rather bold in appearance, fluent talker, speaks good English with very little German accent. And whereas said persons are at large and fugitives from justice, now, therefore, I, Thomas A. Osborne, Governor of the State of Kansas, in pursuance of law, do hereby offer a reward of $500 for the apprehension and delivery to the sheriff of Labette County, Kansas, of each of the persons above named. So I guess 500 for each, 2,000 if all 4 of them were captured. In testimony whereof I have hereunto described to my name and cause the great seal of the state to be affixed. Done at Topeka this 17th day of May, 1873. Thomas A. Osborne. So that was the reward flyer, and here's a picture. I guess this is where the men were digging up the bodies on their land. Yeah, this is a photograph showing a large group of men looking at the graves of those murdered by the Bender family, Labette County, Labette County, Kansas. This is a newspaper clipping about the Bender family published August 12th, 1880. And as you can see, it says, a man and his wife by the name of Bender, who have committed numerous murders in Kansas by slaying travelers who were so unlucky as to stop overnight in their house, have been arrested in Nebraska and will be carried back to Kansas for trial. The family consisted of 4 persons, a man and wife, and their 2 children, both of whom were grown, one a man and the other a woman. They kept a sort of wayside inn, and whoever entered this to seek shelter in their quarters never saw the light of day again. The 2 younger ones have not been caught. So this article is from 1880, when they thought they had captured the 2 elder Benders. But to my knowledge, they have never proven that they actually had any of the Bender family members in custody for these crimes, and they don't know what happened to them. This is the historical marker in Kansas about the Bloody Benders. I'm going to let the computer read the inscription.
The Bloody Benders. Near here are the Bender Mounds, named for the infamous Bender family John, his wife, son, and daughter Kate, who settled here in 1871. Kate soon gained notoriety as a self-proclaimed healer and spiritualist. Secretly, the 4 made a living through murder and robbery. Located on a main road, the Benders sold meals and supplies to travelers. Their murders were carried out by use of a canvas curtain that divided the house into 2 rooms. When a traveler was seated at the table, his head was outlined against the curtain. The victim was then dispatched from behind with a hammer, and the body was dropped into a basement pit, later to be buried in an orchard. As more and more travelers disappeared, suspicion began to center on the Benders. They disappeared in the spring of 1873, shortly before inquisitive neighbors discovered the victims' bodies. The Benders are believed to have killed about a dozen people, including one child. Although stories abound, the ultimate fate of the murderous Bender family is uncertain. Some say they escaped, others that they were executed by a vengeful posse. Their story is unresolved, and remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the Old West. This historical marker was erected by Kansas State Historical Society and Kansas Department of Transportation. It is in Moorhead in Montgomery County, Kansas.
And here's another picture of it, where it's at. This article is from Crime Reads. It's titled The Bloody Benders, America's First Family of Serial Killers. Is written by Nao Capello. And this article is from 2019, August of 2019. It says the family of killers behind an infamous legend. When it comes to true crime, Mark Twain was right. Truth is stranger than fiction, but it's also more dangerous, and real-life horror stories don't only spread fear, they can also spread rumors, often making it difficult to discern fact from fabrication. That first paragraph is so true. It's a lot of times true crime becomes folklore. It becomes embellished over the years. And like back in the 1800s, there wasn't television or the internet, so people just, history lived on by people either writing about it or storytelling. And as we know today, it all depends on who's doing the writing and what their motivation is, or how, honest and ethical they are, or how sensational they're trying to be to sell more magazines or newspapers, as to, do they have the facts right in what they've written, or are they just writing, and adding their own embellishments to sell a story, to sell newspapers and magazines. So like today, back then, authors who wrote books or magazine articles or newspaper articles may not have always had the facts correct. Take Lizzie Borden, who killed her parents with around 10 whacks each instead of the 40 depicted in the morbid children's rhyme. The real Amityville horror was Robert DeFeo Jr., who killed his father, mother, two brothers, and two sisters in the house that would later become the focus of paranormal speculation. And while it's unconfirmed whether the inspiration for Texas Chainsaw Massacre's Leatherface, serial killer Ed Gein actually committed cannibalism, the items found in his house of horrors went far beyond the infamous mask of human skin. In April 1873, on a homestead in Labette County, Kansas, another of these stories was unfolding, one that would leave a local family with a nickname that remains infamous almost 150 years later. This is the story of the Bloody Benders, America's first family of serial killers. The Bender story begins, like many from this time period, thanks to the Homestead Act of 1862. After the Civil War, the Osage Indians were moved from their home in Labette County to Oklahoma in order to make the Kansas Territory available to European settlers. In October 1870, 5 families moved to this area of Osage, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, settling around 7 miles from where the city of Cherryville would be established. One of these families was the Benders, who moved onto a 160-acre property facing the Osage Trail. The men, John Bender Sr. and Jr., were first to arrive, thought to be German immigrants. The elder Bender was around the age of 60 and spoke little English and with a thick accent, while the younger Bender was around 25, spoke English well but with an accent, and had a habit of laughing aimlessly that led some to label him a half-wit. After the men had prepared the land with a cabin and barn, the women arrived in 1871. Elvira Bender, who went by Ma, was around the age of 55, spoke little English, and was so unfriendly that neighbors dubbed her She-Devil. The star of the family was unarguably Kate, an attractive 23-year-old who spoke English fluently and worked as a self-proclaimed healer and psychic who held seances, claimed to cure illnesses, and gave lectures on spiritualism. Though occultism wasn't necessarily unusual at the time, Kate's advocacy for free love, earned her particular notoriety and drew fans to the Bender property. There, the family had used canvas to split the one-room cabin into two parts. The back was kept as the living quarters, while the front was converted into a general store, kitchen, and dining table where travelers could stop for dry goods, a meal, or even a night of rest. But Bender Inn wasn't the safe haven it pretended to be, and would soon become the focus of an inquisition into a series of mysterious disappearances and deaths in the region. The bloodshed started in May 1861 when a man was found in Drum Creek, southeast of the Bender property in what would become Montgomery County, with his skull crushed and his throat slashed. In February 1872, two more men were found with the same unique injuries. By the fall of that year, travelers had started to disappear off the Osage Trail. Reports of the murdered and missing soon spread through the region, and travelers began avoiding the route. Meanwhile, vigilante groups tried with little success to hold someone accountable, often arresting and then releasing innocent men. But it was the disappearance of George Newton Longcore, also reported as Launcher, that set in motion the series, and I've also seen it as Lochner, that set in motion the series of events that would eventually expose the truth about these mysterious disappearances and deaths. After the death of his wife, Longcore and his 18-month-old daughter Mary Ann had left Independence, Kansas for Iowa, but never made it. Soon, Dr. William Henry York, Longcore's former neighbor, who'd sold Longcore horses and a wagon for the trip, was alerted that the team had been found abandoned near Fort Scott, Kansas. As such, Dr. William York set out looking for Longcore and Mary Ann in spring of 1873. He questioned homesteaders along the trail as he made his way to Fort Scott, where he identified the wagon and horses as those he sold to Longcore and clothes found as belonging to the father and daughter. But on his way back to Independence, Dr. York made a fatal decision, stopping at the Bender Inn. Dr. York never returned. What the Benders didn't realize was that their latest victim came from a prominent family. Dr. York's two brothers were Colonel Ed York and Alexander M. York, a member of the Kansas State Senate. Colonel York quickly organized a search party of 75 men who searched the area for Dr. York, and in March 1873 tracked him to the Bender Inn. In this initial meeting, the Benders denied any knowledge of Dr. York and suggested that the traveler may have met with foul play at a remote location near Drum Creek, where John Jr. claimed to have been shot at around the same time as Dr. York disappeared. Without any proof they were involved in his brother's disappearance, Colonel York had no choice but to leave Bender Inn. Yet Colonel York soon found more evidence against the Benders and returned on April 3rd with armed men. There, Colonel York confronted them about a woman who claimed to have fled the Bender Inn after Elvira threatened her with knives and pistols. Though Elvira initially pretended not to understand English, she began yelling about how the woman had cursed her coffee when Colonel York repeated the accusation. Elvira then kicked the men out, but it was too late. Elvira had already revealed both her mastery of the English language as well as her true nature. Hoping to diffuse the situation, Kate offered to use her psychic abilities to assist Colonel York in his search for his brother. She told him that if he returned that Friday night with fewer men, she would show him to Dr. York's grave. Around the same time, neighboring communities began to accuse Osage of being responsible for the disappearances. To address the issue, the local township held a public meeting in the Harmony Grove schoolhouse in which the community agreed to obtain search warrants for every property between Big Hill Creek and Drum Creek. Colonel York, John Bender Sr., John Bender Jr. were all in attendance. A few days later, a local noticed that animals on the Bender property were dead or starving. Upon investigating, elected Township Officer Leroy Dick found that the property had been abandoned and that there was a bad odor coming from a trapdoor nailed shut and underneath a bed. His subsequent call for a search party turned up hundreds of locals wielding shovels and pickaxes, ready to search the Bender Inn. What they found was a scene of such gore that, should Stephen King himself have written it as fiction, critics may have called it far-fetched. Underneath the trapdoor was an empty room where they found the smell, coming from clotted blood, had soaked through the stone floor into the soil below. Not finding any bodies, the search made its way to Elvira and Kate's vegetable garden and apple orchard, where they would find Dr. York buried in a shallow grave. By the next day, at least 10 bodies had been recovered from the garden, and well, along with additional dismembered body parts. The same modus operandi, the victims were hit in the head, likely with a hammer, before having their throats slit, was evident on all bodies except that of Mary Ann, who was likely buried alive. Mary Ann was a young girl. Many of the bodies had also been indecently mutilated, possibly suggesting genital trauma. I'm not sure about that, but that's what this article has said, but I'm not sure if that's a factual fact, let's say. Based on the evidence and stories told by survivors of the Bender Inn, it is believed that guests were given the seat of honor at the dining table, which backed up against the canvas room divider and was positioned over the trap door to the cellar. Once the victim was sitting, one of the men would knock the visitor out with a hammer from behind. One of the women would then slit the victim's throat to make sure they were dead. The body would then be dropped through the trap door, stripped, and later buried or dismembered. Though some victims were wearing valuables or carrying cash, a lack of targeting suggests the Benders killed for the thrill, not for the money. Around a dozen bullet holes were also found in the cabin, likely from victims who tried to fight back. One of the few items found in the cabin was a Bible with notes in German, which identified John Jr. as one John Gebhardt. This, as well as reports from neighbors, suggest that John Jr. and Kate may have actually been a couple instead of brother and sister. In fact, it is now believed that none of the four were actually named Bender, and that only the mother and daughter were related. Elvira is thought to have been born Almira Mark in the Adirondack Mountains and to have had multiple children and husbands, some say who died of head injuries before she took up the Bender alias. John Sr. was likely born John Flickinger before immigrating from either Germany or the Netherlands, and Kate Bender as Elvira's fifth child, Eliza Griffith. In the wake of the gruesome discoveries made on the Bender property, both State Senator Alexander York and Kansas Governor Thomas A. Osborne offered substantial rewards for the apprehension of the family. Detectives followed wagon tracks to find the family's horses, who'd been abandoned outside of Thayer, just 12 miles north of the inn. From there, it's hard to tell what is real and what is urban legend. Some say that John Jr. and Kate traveled by railroad to an outlaw colony near the border of Texas and New Mexico, where law enforcement wouldn't go. And law enforcement wouldn't go past the border because a lot of law enforcement people and others who went past the border never returned. New Mexico wasn't a state at the time, of course. It was a territory, and it was, of course, the Wild Wild West. New Mexico didn't become a state until 1912, I believe. One detective even claimed to have tracked John Jr. to the border and found that he died of apoplexy, and I believe that's a stroke or a blood clot, something like that. Meanwhile, there were reports that Ma and Pa Bender had fled toward St. Louis, Missouri. For many years after the crimes, two women traveling together would be accused of being Kate and Elvira Bender. And though several vigilante groups would claim to have caught and killed the Benders, none provided evidence or claimed the cash reward. So there's lots of stories about them being caught or killed by vigilante groups or various other people, but there's no proof. And to my thinking, nobody really knows what happened to them, because if they had been killed by a vigilante group who knew who they were, they would have turned them in for money. I assume you could bring them back dead or alive, but I could be wrong. Maybe killing them without bringing them back alive was illegal back then too. In 1884, an elderly man who investigators said matched the description of Pa Bender was arrested in Idaho for a murder committed with a hammer. While waiting for more details from Kansas, the man tried to escape by severing his foot. He ended up bleeding to death and decomposed before an identification could be made. In 1889, a mother, Almira, and daughter, Sarah Elizabeth, were arrested for larceny in Michigan and subsequently accused of being Elvira and Kate Bender. But when they were brought to Kansas, a panel from Labette County meant to confirm their identity provided inconsistent results. With significant doubt of their identity as the Benders, the women were released and sent back to Michigan. But while the Benders themselves were likely never held accountable for the murders committed in Labette County, others were certainly punished for their crimes. 12 men in total were charged as accessories for helping dispose of the stolen goods. This included Mitt Cherry, a member of the vigilante committee who, it was later revealed, forged a letter to a victim's wife that made it appear as if he'd arrived safely. So even though they may not have participated in the murders, they did help dispose of stolen goods, which makes me think they probably more than just the Bender family knew what was going on or had an idea of what was happening there at the Bender Inn. But it was a wild, wild west. Life was hard. A lot of people went missing, and so I guess a lot of people just didn't have a conscience to put a stop to it, and they just enjoyed the benefits of it, even though they may not have participated specifically in the murders. As the story of the Benders spread across the country in the years following the murder spree, thousands of tourists and souvenir hunters flocked to the Benders' former homestead, looting the property down to the bricks lining the cellar and stones lining the well. Hammers allegedly from the home have been displayed at the Cherryville Museum, while a stained knife thought to have been taken from the Bender Inn now belongs to the Kansas Historical Society. To this day in Kansas, a traveling mother and daughter might be teased about being Ma and Kate Bender, the women, like the legend itself, immortal in their infamy. Most of all, the story of the Bloody Benders has endured because of its ability to inspire fictional accounts, including one by famous prairie writer Lori Ingalls Wilder, who claimed that Paul Ingalls had joined a vigilante hunt and that she'd come to her own conclusion as to what he meant when he said the family would never be found in her annotated autobiography, Pioneer Girl. But while there is some evidence that the Ingalls family may have encountered victim George Lunker, the Ingalls family had already left Kansas for Wisconsin by the time the Benders moved to the area. Yet, she's far from the only writer hoping to cash in on the crimes committed by this family. An episode of Supernatural featured a family of serial killers named the Benders, while two of the main characters in the video game Red Dead Redemption are modeled after John Jr. and Kate Bender. While the fate of the Bender family may never truly be known, the Bloody Benders live on in the legend, a real-life horror story forever ingrained into the collective memory of the Kansas plains and beyond. It's so hard to know exactly what happened to the Bender family because, one, there's a lot of stories, folklore about it, but also, back then there's just no way to trace people. There wasn't or weren't, DNA evidence and cell phone cameras and security cameras all over the place like there is today. So if they went and lost themselves somewhere in the United States or in a territory of the United States, they could just, hide in plain sight and people would recognize them, especially if they split up. They might have split up where the elder Benders went somewhere and the younger Benders went somewhere, or the women went somewhere and the men went somewhere. So who knows if they ended up being killed by other bad people, being killed by vigilantes who just for whatever reason never asked for reward money or turned them in to police, or maybe they killed each other, or they died of natural causes, or died from some other kind of horrific death back then. Like, killed by Indians or something like that. An interesting side note to go along with the Bender family murders is some information I found regarding one of the men who was eventually arrested for being an accessory to these crimes by the Bender family. His last name was Brockman. And on Wikipedia, if you can trust Wikipedia, but I also found the information elsewhere, so I'm going to read this paragraph from Wikipedia. A Kansas newspaper reported that the crowd was so incensed after finding the bodies that a friend of the Benders named Brockman, who was among the onlookers, was hanged from a beam in the inn until unconscious, revived, interrogated, then hanged again. After the third hanging, they released him, and he staggered home as one who was drunken or deranged. So this is, right after they find the bodies, and the crowd's angry. And so apparently they got one of the Bender's family friends, and they hanged him and interrogated him, and who knows what else to him. But they kept, hanging him but not killing him. And then they finally let him go. But his last name was Brockman. But years later, this same man, he was eventually arrested, and I guess, I don't know if he spent some time in jail for being an accessory to the crimes of the Bender family, not the murders, but I guess, receiving or selling stolen property or whatever. But the same man, and here they have him as Breckman, but in the Wikipedia, I think they called him Brockman. Yeah. But anyway, it's the same person, the same man who did some time in jail or was arrested. One of the 12 men arrested as being an accessory to the murders or for selling stolen property anyway. He got in trouble for that. So he survived, the hangings that the angry crowd did to him when they found the dead bodies. And he survived, I guess, his jail term for the stolen property that he was a part of. So he was out of prison, and he went on, I guess, and he had kids or more kids. I don't know if he had kids before or whatever, but he actually had a daughter after all of this was said and done, and he got out of prison or jail. Years later, he was arrested again for raping and murdering his own 18-year-old daughter. And it says here, this is an old newspaper article about it. It says, Sheriff saves the neck of a man who murdered his own daughter. Sherryville, Kansas, November 17th. A German named Breckman has been hurried to the Oswego jail from the Bender settlement north of here to prevent his being lynched for having ruined and murdered his 18-year-old daughter, and ruined means raped. The neighbors yesterday found the girl in the Breckman barn, unconscious and nearly dead. Her father it is alleged, had ruined her and then beaten her into insensibility. And she did die. It's the Inter-Ocean, Chicago, Illinois, Wednesday, November 18th, 1896. So remember, the Bender family crimes happened in the 1870s, and I guess months later he was arrested as being an accessory in regards to the stolen goods. And then, he's set free, and he goes on to murder and rape his own 18-year-old daughter, who was born after he got away with all the other stuff. He went and had a daughter. So in my opinion, it's too bad that he survived what they did to him on that day that they found the bodies, because he went on to make a daughter and then murder her in a horrific way. So that's an interesting side note about the case of the Bender family. And then another interesting side note is the connection to the Kelly family. The Kelly family is another crime family or murderous family that some people think are the Bender family or related to the Bender family, some of the members anyway, in some way. But according to a news report from contemporary media, an unnamed man from Kansas City who had investigated the Bender family's house and the rumors of their deaths claimed that the Kelly family were the Benders. The man further elaborated that all the stories of the latter's capture were made up, supposedly by a group of Confederates who have also helped the Benders dispose of the murdered victims' horses and wagons. He pointed out that both families' modus operandi, family unit numbers, and other evidence prove that they are the same. So some people think that the Kelly family was the Bender family. I don't really believe that. because it seems more likely to me that they would have split up, possibly to avoid capture or to avoid being recognized. But one thing that makes it possible that they were somehow either the same four family members or maybe two or three of the same members with one different person was that they had the same modus operandi, which means that they also killed people by having a false floor that they would fall into, and then they would axe them to death if they didn't die from the fall. So the Kelly family is another murderous family, and I believed they operated in Oklahoma, I think. So that's another interesting side note regarding the story of the Bender family murders. This is the Montgomery County, Kansas Genealogy Trails History Group website, and it has compiled a lot of the original news articles on the Bender family. It talks about the crimes they committed at the time they happened, and then they have articles about, for in the years after the crimes, how they would arrest different people who they thought might be one of the Bender family members. And they talk about the investigation and the tracking of them while they were on the run and stuff like that. Just lots and lots of different articles. The original articles are compiled on this website. So I'm going to link it down below for anybody who's interested in all the various people that got arrested or claimed to have got arrested for being the murderers or claimed to have killed the murderers, like in a vigilante type situation. So I mean, a lot of people claim to have, like on their deathbeds, claim that they knew what happened to the Bender family, that they killed them. I guess like with any high-profile case today, back then people wanted to be known for something or wanted to be associated with something or someone who was famous. And so a lot of people claim to have known what happened to the Bender family or claim to have killed them themselves. So I'm going to link this website down below, and there's lots of original news articles have been, I guess, copy and pasted into this website that you can read over if you like.